why don't you, Phil and Vibbs, introduce yourselves? That way will save me the introduction. I won't leave out
Sure.
anything important.
No worries, Vijay. Wonderful to see all of you here. Thanks for joining. I'm Abhishek. I'm a faculty here at UC Irvine, Vijay's colleague. I was at CMU before this, and I came and visited, and Vijay attracted me to the place. Moved here mostly because of the great team that we have here. I also run this company called Altius. It's a GenAI company focused on financial services. We started a couple of years back before ChatGPT was cool. So really interested in what's happening in this space, and AI is cool again. So we have to sort of be in this space and doing a lot of cool stuff here.
Phil?
Hey, know most of you guys. Phil Potloff, GM at AWS Software Marketplace. Been part of the Roundtable for like 15 years, I think. So one of the old timers now.
So cool. With that, again, welcome to all of you, and thank you for your support over the years. I sort of emerged, I should say seemingly out of nowhere, because if you've been watching the space, it's been around, but it's exploded into the public consciousness, and I'm sure all your boards and CEOs are putting pressure on all of you to sort of think about generative AI, and there's so many use cases for it. And so, for me, especially at the center, we've been thinking a lot about, well, this is, by the way, we launched in 2012, and now we're in 24, and we're thinking like, what do we do for the next 10 years? And, when AI hit, sort of our research agenda shifted, our programming agenda shifted in a way that we weren't really anticipating, which is a good thing, because it's brought a level of excitement that, I was beginning to worry about it. How long is this digital transformation journey going to keep going? Will it fade? Will there be as much interest as there was in the past? And, that's a difficult journey, and everybody's still on it. But now it's become an AI-powered or AI-centered digital transformation journey, which adds a new twist, because, here I'm preaching to the choir, but AI is so different from traditional software in so many different ways. And then we have generative AI, of course, within that. And I think there's so much to talk about, because I think this is my opinion now, this is not based on science but it's like everybody stopped talking about what we would call special or weak or narrow AI and generative AIs, but still, and the two are converging, because at the end of the day, generative AI is an application of deep learning. And you keep seeing sort of all these examples. Generative AI is going to do this, generative AI is going to do that. And then you start paying attention, and you realize that it's, at the end of the day, it's like you don't know where one begins and the other, well, one ends and the other begins, because it's all sort of deep learning applications. If you use transformer architecture, you sort of start seeing huge overlaps between the two. So I've asked Vibbs, who was actually trained in AI. I actually looked at my transcript. I moved houses, and I found my original transcript. I took a class called Introduction to AI, but that was sort of the expert systems kind of AI, not the AI machine learning that we talk about today. And then Phil, as general manager of the third-party software marketplace at AWS, he and I have been having some really interesting conversations about what it actually takes from the user perspective to embrace generative AI. Like, what is the AI stack that you need? And tons of experience across a very large and very diverse set of clients as to what their expectations are, what their obstacles are, what their opportunities are. So I thought putting the two of them together. So Vibbs is going to talk about the AI landscape as he sees it, as somebody who is very well versed in the technology of AI, and increasingly with the experience he's got at Altius, which he founded and is the CEO of, lots and lots of hands-on experience as well. So with that, Vibbs, take it away and tell us about how you see the AI landscape. And of course, and to the group, let's keep this as interactive as possible.
Yep.
So just raise your hands, and I'm sure Vibbs will see it. We're also experiencing Zoom these days. That I don't think it's going to be. Thanks to you and Phil for participating. And with that, take it away.
Thank you so much, Vijay. It's, I love talking about AI. I've been doing AI probably for the last 25 years. So finally it's hot. So glad to be talking about this. Vijay, you touched upon two very interesting themes, which is, how generative AI is very different from, or seemingly different from, classical AI or predictive AI that came before it. And second, I think there's a fundamental shift that is happening that I'll just touch upon very quickly now, and maybe I'll talk about it later. is when we think about software, we have always thought about software as tools, helping people do their jobs better. What is happening now, probably for the very first time, and this is something that we're observing with a lot of our customers, is there is a lot of emphasis on outcomes and not so much on the tools. So, like on customer support or sales, can we really move outcomes? And the generative AI tooling that is there is helping change that conversation and saying, how is this SaaS software or tool not helping a real person do their jobs better, but overall it takes control of the process to some extent and drive a 2x, 3x, 10x outcome. And I think that's a very fundamental shift. I think it'll take us some time to really understand what the shift means to the overall economy. But I would love to sort of also get your perspective on how things are going on that front. So without further ado, I'll just give a very quick introduction about myself. I think Vijay already did a great job. So I've been doing AI for many years. I was trained as a computer scientist, then got pulled into the business world at Wharton, where I did my PhD. Really at the intersection of machine learning and business. And then I was a faculty at Carnegie Mellon. And then a couple of years, I was really enchanted by the Southern California weather. So ended up moving here. I've also worked, I am an academic at heart, but I've also been a practitioner. I've worked with many startups over the years, many big companies, specifically around how do you apply AI and machine learning to solve business problems. And, for me, I think I did see that inflection point, right? As someone who has worked in AI for many years, I did see how powerful generative AI was. And in my mind, this was like a dramatic shift. So, things have been happening. Deep learning has been around for quite some time, probably about 2 decades now. But really the power of generative AI, and especially large language models, is, I would say, the real step function in computing that we have been waiting for. So I'd love to talk more about that. Before I get into generative AI, I do want to touch upon what we have referred to, or we are referring to now, as more classical or predictive AI. And the reason I want to focus on that is I do still think that there is a lot of value in some of these tools. So, think about models that you would have built for churn prevention, or for quality assurance, for predicting risks of different types. Thinking about, rehospitalization, for example, Scott. So they have all of these models that have been built over time that are very, very powerful, and they're actually useful more than powerful. And I think they continue in this new era of generative AI. I think these models still continue to do certain things very, very well, which generative AI models are not able to do. And I think we have seen that even in the way that we have built a platform. We think that generative AI tools are good for certain things, but not for all types of things. And some of these more predictive AI models or classical AI models are much better at doing some of these stuff. So I'll talk about that in a bit. But what is really generative AI? And I think, I think if you talk to many people who are experts in this area, some of them will say that generative AI is nothing new. We have had predictive AI, we had language models for a very long time. They were predicting what's the next token. But I think there's something definitely very, very new right now. In my mind, I think there are 2 things that are new. One is the ability to generate new types of content, which is new, content that has never existed before, right? And you can argue that it's based on data that has been there for a long time. It's trained on all the internet data. But really, the content is very new and unique in a lot of cases. It's not verbatim quoting things that have been said before. And second, I think it really leads to fundamentally new ideas. It has some sense of structure. It has some sense of the world. These models, language models, I'm saying it, but these language models have some sense of the world. And they can come up with seemingly interesting and innovative ideas that are not garbage. And I think this ability is probably evolved only in the last 2-3 years. If you go back before 2022, the language models that were there were not as powerful to be able to do that. And I believe a lot of that comes from how complicated these models have become and the number of neurons and the nodes in these models. So I think there is some level of emergence that is happening just because of the complexity of these models. And I think we're still trying to figure out why that is happening. But just sheer size of these models has given it emergent abilities that we would not have expected. Now, I would love to pause here and would love to understand, what are some of the Gen AI projects that folks have been thinking about, have been involved in, or have been just ideating in this front.
David,
Anyone?
But before the answer, people are asking if they can get the slides, and I said the answer is yes, but I assume
of course, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll start it off. There's development AI going on around the university, and anything related to health is relatively new, and we're being very, very careful, especially as you work your way towards what we call clinical decision support in the moment.
Right.
It's one thing to look at the back office and help with revenue cycle and things like that. One of the areas where we actually invested in, and we're a customer of a company that was incubated actually at UPMC, is being used elsewhere. We call it ambient listening. And so a conversation between a provider and a patient is recorded. Typically, the patient never objects. And the note of the conversation is essentially done at the end. Extraneous information is discarded. And so we're saving the physician, 10, maybe even more minutes of time having to do that after the fact, which is usually incomplete, or later in the day, which is worse, or later in the week, even more distant from when it actually happened. We also can take that note and translate it into something in plain English at a language level, let's say 8th grade, and put it into the patient's chart, patient's portal, right? So we're really excited about that as a commercial product, but it's new. And that's one of the big things in medicine.
That's very interesting to know, Scott. One of my friends also started this company called A Bridge that's in a very similar space. Oh, okay.
That's it. Yeah, okay. Shiv Rao's become a personal friend, and we invested in his company, and we're actually doing quite well with that investment.
Yeah, I think they've been doing quite well. So it's a very interesting use case. It's always been a big problem. These medical notes, how do you summarize them? How do you make them more readable? And I think finally that problem is getting solved. And I think so I think there's one interesting thing that you mentioned, Scott, given that healthcare is so sensitive, some of these use cases are more what we call internal facing use cases, where there is a level of human involvement in looking at this information and acting on it, rather than the generative AI really sort of taking that information and acting on its own accord. Anyone wants to talk about some other examples of how they're thinking of generative AI use cases?
Thomas, anything in English?
Well, we're not in healthcare, but we have some of the same, right? We're right now in the process of changing our contact center customer care solution, and obviously one of the things, or some of the things we're looking at are the recording of the calls, the summary of the calls, the inserting them into the customer CRM records, etc. So we do that for sure. We work on some other things as well. All the things you can imagine, the chatbots, the support, the internal, the external facing. It's part of everything we do today. And then I think it's also let's say it's increased the focus on, I don't know what you would call it, VIPs, but more traditional machine learning that we use for insights, recommendation, things that we do now that we go through our digital transformation. So whatever is generative AI versus more traditional machine learning, but I'd say we're probably working on, since last we spoke, we probably have added like 50 or so initiatives in different areas. If you look across the entire company, everywhere from I think I might have mentioned last time or not, but the weights and dimensions of the SKUs that come into our warehouse, we ground it first with with search results, and then we use the generative AI models or the LLMs to format it and to come back in a format that we can then ingest directly into our system. So it's very widespread. It's from that all the way to summarizing notes of meetings that we have. So we're all over the place, and we're still just seeing the beginning of it, I think.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thomas,
I can just tell you that we're trying Copilot. I can give you a not so great example. So people are we're trying out Copilot and talking about UCI. So we have our executive health checkups at UCI Executive Health, and someone came to me a couple of weeks ago and said, "Hey, I was trying out Copilot and I used your name, and I can see that you had an appointment at UCI Executive Health back in 2022 or 23, whenever it was, because which that and many other things has made us realize that we must do a much better job of categorizing data in our own. So this was from our own SharePoint sites, and it was stored somewhere where people apparently had some access, or Copilot got access. So they didn't see my test results, but they knew I had been there. So now we have a little bit of a discussion in the company of how do we tag, how do we categorize, how do we get the right data available, because the new engines have so much more power when it comes to digging out the data that people otherwise would not have found.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Thomas. I'll definitely touch upon that. Where is this data going? How is it getting used? And there's some of the limitations that come with LLMs, right? Once you train an LLM on these models, then you can't really untrain. You can't say, here, I want to remove Thomas's data from this LLM. That doesn't happen. So there are architectures that can overcome that problem. But thanks for this, a few of the examples you gave. And so, and just a quick segue into what we're doing at Altius. We started life, before ChatGPT, we started life as a general purpose AI assistant builder platform. But since then, we have graduated into customer support and sales as use cases. And I think there's a very big power of LLMs in these customer-facing interactions. I think it's more challenging because you want to be correct most of the time. You cannot afford to make mistakes, but it really scales up your customer interactions, and that can have a dramatic impact overall on the revenues of the company, the experience that your customers get, and everything else. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about the architecture that we have towards the end. But the point I brought it up was we are seeing a lot of value in customer support and sales applications, and clearly ROI that's coming out of those projects. Now, I think everyone is aware of this. I just wanted to touch very quickly on what is happening in these language models. And I do want to make sure that everyone is on the same page in how these models are really trained. So these models are trained to do exactly one thing, which is predict the next token. In fact, there are different variants of these models, but the most commonly used models are next token prediction machines. And what they do is they look at a bunch of text and say, which word should come next? And once it is predicted the next word, then it looks at let's say I'm looking at the last 10 words and saying which one should come next. Then I've looked at the last 11 words and then saying which is the 12th word, and so on and so forth. So what's happening with something like ChatGPT is every time it's trying to predict the next word, but our experience sort of says it's creating all of this huge piece of prose that has some meaning in it. So these models are not trained to be, know about the world. They are not trained to be accurate. They are not trained to be, sources of information. They're just trained to be next token prediction machines. Somehow, as we have trained them, and these models are fairly large, we have gotten these emergent behavior on, some kind of knowledge retention. We have gotten behaviors around some bit of knowledge synthesis, which is what is interesting. And, that's causing all the hype that's coming about. But at a very basic level, I want to make sure that everyone understands that these models are not trained to be accurate. These models are just trained to be verbose. And that's what they do very, very well, right? So if we want them to be accurate, we need to do other things, that are not part of the LLM architecture, because that's just not what they're programmed to do. I see Phil nodding. Maybe he'll talk a little bit about that when he talks about how do you take these things to production. And the real breakthrough here has come, I teach this class on NLP at UCI. And even before ChatGPT happened, I used to say this is like the golden era of NLP. Maybe the first decade, like the first last 10 years were about deep learning and the advancements that happened in deep learning. But this decade has been more about advancements in natural language processing. And I think the key innovation that happened that has enabled all these language models to come about is this transformer architecture. At a very simple level, what it's doing is it's taking a particular sentence or some piece of text, representing it in a very high dimensional space, to somehow capture the essence of what is being talked about. And then once it captures the essence of what is being talked about, then I can do multiple things, right? So I can convert that into a different language. In fact, this came about as a Google Translate project. Google was a team of researchers at Google working on how to solve this problem of machine translations. And there have been many, many different attempts at this. And so they said, okay, let's use deep learning models to do that. And essentially the innovation that came up with is, I have, let's say, a sentence in French. Now, can I encode this in a high dimensional space that captures the essence of the sentence? And once I've done that, then I can then translate it into any language, right? So I can translate this into English, into Spanish, into Mandarin, and whatnot. Now, once you have this architecture, you can do a lot of other cool things. I can give it one sentence as the training data, and the output is the next sentence, right? So what we have as next token predictions is really coming out of this translation architecture that was built, that once I've captured the essence of what is being talked about, I can then transform it into a different language. I can transform it into the future. And this is what is powering a lot of what's going on in the generative AI landscape. And this is I think this innovation is different from what has happened underlying it's a deep learning model, but there is a specific architecture that has this embedding that really makes the difference. And so this is like the big innovation that happened, which enabled all of what we are seeing. And so I personally believe, and I think we have all seen this over the last year, is there's a dramatic shift in AI applications. I spoke about some of the predictive AI applications earlier. And now there's a shift from those, mundane application to more creative applications where generative AI can write text, can create images, can create videos. And these are things that we would not have imagined AI could do even 3-4 years back. And so that just really opens up the canvas for what we can do with these models as tools, right? Like we can use them to do different things, like sort of talking about how we can use them for summarizing. Something like that would have taken a long time and a lot of data to build with predictive AI applications, but it's relatively easy to do with generative AI. The other thing that's unique about generative AI is they are general purpose machines, right? It's there in the name, GPT, right? General purpose transformer. If you look at some of the classical AI models, they were trained to do one specific task very well. These general purpose transformers can do multiple different tasks. So they can summarize, they can classify, they can create text, and they're not trained specifically to do any of these things. They're just trained to be next token prediction machines, but you can instruct them to do all of these different tasks. They can act as a tutor, they can act as a medical counselor, they can act as a customer support representative. And really, it's the complexity of the network that's enabling it to do all of these different types of tasks, even though it's not specifically trained to do one of them. So I just want to pause there. And if you have any questions in what's new, what's unique, what's different, happy to take those questions. So I have, so if you don't have any question, I have a question for you, right? What do you think is an ability that these large language models have unlocked that have not existed before? from a computing perspective or from a tool perspective, what can we do now that we were not able to do earlier?
Well,
Go ahead.
go ahead. Thomas?
Yeah, no, yeah, I don't know, and you know much more than I do, obviously. We probably could do most of these things before, one way or another. Maybe we can do them in a more general fashion now with with larger but less language models, if you say so. But I think what it has unlocked is the awareness of people that what can be achieved. That like you said, you've been doing this for 20 years. I think you can say that most of these things we could have done 3 years ago or 5 years ago. Otherwise, you wouldn't have started your company, right? But now people suddenly see all these opportunities that can be done, which will then accelerate the development because there will be new use cases coming out. So yeah, that would be my. I don't think it's all that new, except the size of the models, which is much larger, and you can do more things. But you could have done that with specialized models, most of it before.
Can you just avoid programming? I mean, it's what you don't do now, right?
To some extent, yes. You don't need to do that specific. I think that's the general purpose nature of it, right? You don't have to program it to do specific things, which you would have to do earlier. You have to build all of these models for specific problems on specific data sets.
And then we have the compute, which we didn't have before, or maybe we could have acquired, but it would have been much more expensive. So now we can call the OpenAI API or the Gemini API or the Meta AI API, and yeah, all of that work is done for us, right? We don't have to do those investments.
Or the Bedrock API.
Yeah.
Is it an overstatement to say it could converse with humans?
Very interesting. So yes, I think so. Let me talk about, at least again, this is perspective. This is not scientific research, but I think there are a few things that are unique to what these LLMs can do. Thomas, I agree with you, right? A lot of these things we could have done earlier too. But they were difficult to do. We have to build custom models to be able to do that. But one is, it's generally most of these models, even if they're like Llama 7B or 3B, smaller models too, are generally a compendium of the knowledge that exists in the world, right? Of course, they've been trained on all the internet data and everything. But if you wanted to build a search engine based on that, you'll have to build a lot of tooling to build that search engine. Now, all of that knowledge is a part of the network itself. You give it a prompt, it'll give you an answer. It can be right or wrong, but it'll give you an answer based on what it understands about the world. And most of these models understand certain bits about the world, especially the more complicated ones like GPT-4 or Claude do understand significant parts of the world, of the world on the data that they're trained on. Scott, I think what you mentioned really, I feel, is, as someone who's done a lot of work in marketing and advertising for a long time, I feel this is a unique ability. Having that human-like conversation at scale is very unique. And I think even from a LLM perspective or a deep learning perspective, this ability only came about with GPT-3, which was launched in 2022, right? So this is fairly new as an ability in the computing world. But of course, now with better and better models, I think this ability has really taken its own life. The third thing I feel that is very unique is this ability to synthesize data and reason without explicit programming is interesting. Like, I'm amazed by how we can pull data from APIs, we can pull data from documents, and give it to an LLM, and it'll figure out a sensible way of interpreting all of that data and creating a meaningful, summary response using all of that information. And this is without any explicit programming. It's without, maybe you're sort of telling it something with the prompt, but the ability to assimilate that information, I feel, is quite unique. And you can, there's a paper that Microsoft has that talks about how some of these models have intelligence and they have common sense. I wouldn't really stretch it to that extreme, but I do think there is a level of reasoning ability that these models have, which helps us not, we don't need to program them explicitly to do certain tasks, right? And to your point, Scott, I think that is, I feel, a big game changer and a big inflection point in the world of computing. No, so, okay, let's say we have all of these ability. What does it really mean? I think the big shift is, we are just scratching the surface of what is the impact of this technology, but I really do believe that everything we know about work is going to change. Who does what is going to change. How much of this work is done by computers is going to change. What we actually do, what we call work itself, I believe is going to change. And you can have like a conference on any of these different topics. We'll not get into that. But I think we are really scratching the surface of what is the possibility out there. And the reason I think this is such a big shift is when we've applied AI in the past, the metrics that we have looked at is saying, how do we increase the efficiency of something? How can we, let's say, process more credit applications faster, or reduce the errors in, medical errors, for example, by being able to predict better. We've talked about a few percentage points. And here we are talking about actually making someone 2x, 3x, 10x productive. So it's a very big difference in scale in terms of the impact that we're talking about. I'll also be very honest that a lot of this impact has not been delivered. So, this is hypothetical that this can be the impact. We are seeing some signs of this at Altius, and I'm sort of seeing signs with some other companies that I've been interacting with. There's some research on this. So very early stage, but I think the dramatic shift that is coming here is looking from an earlier application of AI where we would say we're looking for a 5% or a 10% increase in efficiency of a particular process, to actually helping human beings do 5, 10 times better or faster a particular task. And I think that is what I believe would really have the big impact on how the labor markets impacted and shifted. So, Vijay, I think I'm at time, but I was pulling in some conversation, so I can speed up or
just
slow
take
down.
a few minutes and let's get to the end of your presentation.
Yeah. So I do want to talk about some of the use cases where we have actually seen success, right? In customer support, we have seen a tremendous amount of success. We have been able to automate 30, 40, 50% of tickets that are coming in, and millions of dollars in savings for some of our customers in a very short amount of time. Like, we have only been around for a couple of years, but in that we have only deployed for the last 8 months or so. And in the short amount of time, we have seen a big impact on customer support. And in fact, what we have observed is we can offer better customer support than your median agent, right? So whatever your median customer support agent was, these chatbots, so to speak, can actually offer you better support. They're more empathetic. They can pull in different pieces of information, which might have taken the agent a long time to pull. So the quality increases, the customers are happier, and at the same time, you're saving a lot on cost because you don't need to employ as many people, or these people are doing more complicated tasks. They're upskilling into different things. They're going from L1 support to L2 support to L3 support. So we've definitely seen a lot of ROI in this. And some examples here are from Altius, but there are other examples from other companies. You've seen sales assistants, so assistants for salespeople. This is similar to what Thomas was talking about. So summarizing calls, can you help the sales agents in the calls find out better products that fit the customer needs? We work with a lot of insurance companies, and as you can imagine, selling insurance is very complicated. Everyone's needs are unique. There are so many different plans. How do you marry the customer's problems with the plans? So that's a very non-trivial problem for an agent to solve in like a 20, 30-minute call. How can we very quickly, shorten that cycle of finding the right, most appropriate plan for the customer, but also then help the agent pitch that plan based on what the customer is saying. And so what all of this does is, even though the agent might be spending the same amount of time, they're now spending their time building that relationship with the customer rather than looking for information. So in a typical, insurance sales call, 50 minutes, 35 of those minutes, 35 to 40 of those minutes were earlier spent on looking for information while the customer was on hold. Now, maybe like a few minutes, 1 or 2 minutes are being spent on looking for information, and most of the time is then spent on actually developing that customer relationship. So big impact there. There is a very interesting paper by Eric Brynjolfsson at Stanford that looks at how productivity increases have happened in customer support. And he talks about a 14% on average increase in productivity. But what is also interesting is he says the impact is higher for people who were in the lowest quartile. So there's a nonlinear effect, or there's a homogeneous effect. People who are actually very good, maybe the impact of generative AI is not as good, but people who are really lagging, that's where generative AI is helping them a lot. And what I think that does is it's actually decreasing the skill gap, right? It's getting the worst salespeople or worst support people actually better. And I think there are other studies that look at consultants, looking at programmers. You're seeing very similar things in those areas too. I think this just came out of the press, right? How Moderna has been using 650 custom GPTs and really supercharged everyone in the team with OpenAI. I think they're saying with 6,000 people, we're able to do the jobs of about 100,000 people in the company. So again, big impact, documented impact that has come about. Programming is another big use case. So this is all great, like all positive, thumbs up for generative AI. But as an academic, as a practitioner, I would want to caution that not everything is great in this land. There are definitely things that we need to think about. The first and foremost being something called hallucination. I think everyone knows hallucinations, and as I mentioned earlier, these large language models have been trained to predict next token and not to be accurate. And if you're using them as something that comes out of ChatGPT as gospels of truth, then that's a big problem. So we need to be very, very sure that the content that is being served up is accurate. And that's a very big problem or a very big part of making these generative AI models go live in production. How do you solve the problem of hallucinations? There are many different approaches. There are approaches called RAG, which is retrieval augmented generation. You're adding your content, your enterprise content to these LLMs to be able to generate the accurate answer. They're grounded in your sources of content. There is a symbolic AI approach that we have adopted and pioneered to some extent that is helping solve this problem. But hallucination, I think, is the biggest problem that needs to be solved, which leads to what we call accuracy. I think the second problem is of security, which is what Thomas talked about. Once you have put data into these models, you don't know how these models will survive that. There was this case of some Samsung engineers using ChatGPT to write code. And what that led to is all of Samsung's code base being available on ChatGPT, right? So very big no-no. So that's one big issue. Third issue is scale. How do you scale up these models? So if you take an endpoint from OpenAI or Claude, Bedrock even, they can solve like 300 to 400 queries a minute. But a lot of production use cases need you to be at hundreds of thousands of queries per minute. How do you scale up that? That's a big challenge that a lot of companies are running into. Again, control and compliance. How do you control the user interactions? There is something called prompt injection. I think we have seen examples with, I think Chevy, where someone could prompt Chevy's chatbot to sell a Chevy, like I forget which car it was, but for $1, and then they had to honor that because of the regulation of the local state. And I think something similar happened with Air Canada, where they could do prompt injection to actually get the bot to do something that it was not supposed to do. So how do you solve that problem? And then, of course, compliance, right? Think about toxicity, think about racism. these models are trained on internet data, and we know the issues with internet data. So how do you solve some of these problems? So I would say these are big problems to talk about. I can spend probably a couple of hours on each of them separately, but definitely these are problems that you should keep in mind as you take generative AI models to production. And I'm happy to talk about some of them in Q&A or offline, how to go about solving them. So I'll just pause there. And I think there's a bunch of other stuff, but I don't want to walk through all those slides. Just pause here and take any questions.
Hey, Vibs, can you talk about scale again? I missed the risk around scale. I get accuracy and security. What's the risk around scale again?
So if you look at any standard model, publicly available model, they don't have a very high throughput. Typically, you can get from the best of the models, you can probably get about 300 to 400 queries per minute, which is not sufficient for a lot of use cases. So if you think about a customer, a company that has millions of customers, they probably need of the order of a few thousand queries at the very least per minute. And so what that means is you need to have then multiple models that are deployed in the backend to service those customers. And then how do you route between these customers? So it's like not really generative AI, it's really a scale problem that you need to solve. It's a core engineering problem that you need to solve to take some of these models to production. That's not an issue for many companies, but if you look at the large enterprises that we work with, that is definitely an issue that we have to build for that scale where they can answer hundreds of thousands of queries every hour.
Got it.
Vibs, is that why you have, like, for instance, Anthropic with Claude? They now have 3 different Claude 3 models. They have Haiku, which is meant for latency, like chatting, chatbots, and then they have Opus at the high end, which is meant for deep analytics that doesn't require immediate response time, things like that.
Exactly. So latency is part of the issue, which is, sometimes when you are a customer support chatbot, you want answers to be very quick, right? And then there are more complicated use cases where you have to synthesize information or you have to analyze information, which you don't mind waiting even a minute, 2 minutes, a couple of minutes for the answer. So I think from a use case perspective, there's a certain latency that you want from these models. But even if you think about a chatbot model, like I'm just blacking out the name, but the base Claude version, the Claude chat version,
Haiku.
But even that just gives you a certain amount of throughput, which you need to have many such models running in the backend to be able to service a large customer base.
This may touch on scale, but what do you know or what do you foresee with respect to the enormous power consumption that's going on with large language models, and to whatever they're doing to restructure them to make them more efficient? And what's the connection there, if there is any? I assume there is, to new kinds of chip design so that this thing can go to the next leg.
I think that's an excellent question. I think all these models require a lot of compute, which in turn requires a lot of energy. There are new architectures that people are talking about. So there's a company called Grok, GROQ, that has a new architecture called LPU. So it's called Language Processing Unit. That's a lot more efficient and much faster at doing these conversational things, right? So a lot of the architecture right now is built on the hardware is really the GPU hardware, which was built for general purpose deep learning. It's not been adapted yet to the LLM type models or the generative AI use cases. I think there are some things in pipeline. NVIDIA has some things in pipeline, but there are other companies that are trying to custom build these models that you can deploy a transformer architecture very quickly and do a lot of compute very quickly. So there is going to be improvements from a hardware perspective that lead to low energy footprints. But I think the way that we are thinking about, or we are sort of seeing the market evolve, is the energy consumptions assigned to generative AI is definitely going to keep increasing significantly, because there will be more and more use cases. We're just scratching the surface, right? Like, I personally foresee that generative AI is going to be used pretty much in everything that we do at home or at work. And so we need to have enough power to powering all these chips. So there would be a reduction in the footprint of a particular chip or a particular model, but the consumption is just going to blow up, right? So I think in net, this will be a big energy sink. I don't know if that answers your question, Scott.
Well,
or
it,
not.
it kind of does. I'm wondering if the new chip design will be somewhat like predictive AI, that is very purpose-driven, purpose-specific, or whether it'll still be of a general nature.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think, I think it'll be specific to running a language model or a generative AI model, but these models are general by design. So, I think that's one, you're touching upon a great point, right? Which is, a lot of times your predictive AI models are not only better, but also a lot more efficient because, the model is not as complex. It does just one thing, does it very well, and does it super fast. I'll just give an example. Like a company like DoorDash probably runs billions of these prediction models every day. And we did this calculation earlier. If you were to run all of those workflows through generative AI, it will cost them like $40 million every day for that level of compute, right? So clearly, it's not, for a lot of use cases, generative AI is not the solution. So you have to use it selectively.
Yeah.
Any closing questions for Vibs before we turn the floor over to Phil? Actually, Vibs, I have a closing question for you, if I can ask one myself. So, I think the transformer model has surprised everybody, because in terms of how many use cases there are when you sort of think about sort of what the essential properties of large language models, and it fits for sort of genetic analysis, genome analysis, to all, these, what they call the omics analysis, proteomics, blah, blah, out of my depth here. But so that part, but what are the limitations? Like, what context does it not apply to?
Oh, I think there are many contexts that it doesn't apply to. I think it's like, the way I think about this, it's a tool that has certain attributes, right? It can have human-like conversation. It can synthesize bits of information. I'm just talking about specifically LLMs, but generative AI more broadly, I think I think there is broader scope, but there's also limitation. Hallucination I talked about, right? There is a big problem. And so if you really, really want to be very sure, in some cases, then generative AI is not a way to go. Like, for example, very real use case for us, we have something called an intent manager, which tries to figure out, when the customer is having a conversation, what is it that they're trying to do? And we tried very hard with generative AI models. It's much easier to do something like that, like to get started. But for the life of us, we couldn't get it to work. So then we resorted to a predictive AI model, which is much faster, much easier to train in the land-based scheme of things. You don't need to know how to build those models. But once you've built it, it's much easier to operate. So there are, I would say, I don't think anytime soon these generative AI models are going to be the end all and be all. They will be an important tool in the toolkit of how do you deploy AI solutions.
And it seems like matching business problem to the appropriate type of AI and the model within that type of AI is also critical then.
Oh, of course. Yeah, I think goes without saying.
Sounds good. All right, Phil, take it away. Part 2. Phil.
Thanks, Vijay. Thanks, Vibs. I think what I have to share will be very compatible with your message. Let me just bring up the presentation here. Okay, you guys can see that?
Yep.
So just a quick follow-up intro for those that don't know me well. I've been at AWS for 7 years, and I've been running the software marketplace for the last 2 years. And that's really a product and engineering role. Prior to AWS, I spent 12 years as CIO and Chief Operating Officer at Edmunds.com, the automotive platform. And then before that, I was in Silicon Valley working for Nuance, SpeechRec, and some other startups. So, my as a longtime member of the CIO Roundtable and a multi-decade, like you all, technology buyer, I came originally when it came to Gen AI from a space of extreme cynicism. And that's largely due to, we've been working, and I'll talk more about Amazon briefly, but Amazon's been working with machine learning for 20 plus years. And, it's like all of a sudden, you can't turn on the business news without hearing Gen AI. And, I was like, okay, somebody found a good chat GPT chatbot, and now they're enamored with it. And they really don't understand a lot of this technology has been around. And yes, LLMs are changing that kind of interface, but I was actually forced out of my position out of self-preservation, really, because now being at Amazon, after being a CIO for many years, I'm on the sell side of things. At least I don't sell, but I build products for Amazon. And so we sell to we sell to CIOs, we sell to organizations, we sell to enterprises, our cloud capabilities. And so I could see the organization pivoting around Gen AI as an opportunity, and all of the work that they had been doing in machine learning and AI rapidly moving into this space. And it was like, you get on that train or you're gone, or you're left behind. And so I had to do a lot of introspection here. And so what I'll share with you is kind of the result of my introspection and what I've found in terms of what am I trying to accomplish? What do I think enterprises need to contend with as they look to adopt Gen AI capabilities at scale, as Bibbs was talking about. So I'll just share a little bit, and feel free to jump in at any point with questions or comments. I'm just going to share a little bit about Amazon, because there are some interesting things. And when Bibbs asked the question about, what new things do you think this has enabled? And I have a really good example on the biometric side that you might not think about as an application for Gen AI. And then the main part is just talking about what I think the considerations are for enterprises in pursuing Gen AI capabilities or enabled services. If we have time, I have some use cases, and then we can have some discussion. So any questions before I get started? Cool. Just real briefly, again, in case you don't know what AWS's software marketplace is, this is what I run. We are the equivalent of Amazon's marketplace, but for software in the cloud, third-party software in the cloud. So we work with Thomas's company, Ingram Micro, very closely, and we sell, work with several thousand ISVs and professional services and consulting companies on tens of thousands of products, from Cisco and Splunk to Databricks, CrowdStrike, as well as the Accentures and Orca Securities, and as well as VARs, resellers, distributors like Ingram Micro. And this software is all typically used. We transact software both publicly and through private offers for customers to deploy this third-party software into their AWS environment, typically. All right, so this is part of my cynicism, where it comes from, is that when this first started coming up, this was literally the conversation. It was a joke around my teams, and so really, as a customer at Amazon, we are what we call customer obsessed, and everything we do is work backwards from the customer and customer problems. And this is antithetical to that. So, what does it mean? Where does generative AI really contribute in the grand scheme? Just we're seeing where it sits in the overall AI landscape, and it's been around as a notion for 30 plus years. The core capabilities Vid's talked a lot about already, and you do have primary input and output kind of capabilities, and more there are and I'll share an example of one what we would call multimodal use cases, right? So where you're combining vision and text, among other modes. We all know the hype cycle extremely well, right? And this is what scares me the most, is if you look at Gartner's hype cycle for generative AI, we're literally on the precipice of dropping into the trough of disillusionment, right? So what does that mean practically? It means that a lot of the early hype, the bleeding edge adopters are now going to be saying, where did all that money go we spent? And how do we actually focus, as Viv said, on outcomes, right? For our investment. Like you guys, I always try and navigate this hype cycle over the years, whatever it's been, including cloud, with this path through that without getting fired, right? So be able to answer to your board on the latest trends, and temper their excitement, enthusiasm, with realism, and a real ROI. So this is the challenge we face as enterprise technologists. This dude, Roy Amara, if you guys know him, he worked at Stanford Research Institute for decades, and the company I used to work for, Nuance, was founded there. And I have like the double negative here. I always underestimate technology in the short run, and I never overestimate it, but I always underestimate it in the long run. So I fall into this trap myself, because I write something off early and then I don't come around quickly enough. Containers was an example that I was really behind on, and seeing internally at AWS how much containers are being used. If you can see how much, I'll share some of the AWS Gen AI services, but really for Gen AI workloads and AI machine learning workloads in general, containers and container orchestration is the primary compute layer that's being used, by percentage. And it's pretty amazing how that's really taken over and found its kind of major use case outside of core software application stacks. This is just a couple of interesting points on some of the studies that are being done. Vib's referenced some of them, but this is a McKinsey one where it's like, okay, talking about outcomes, where do you actually get value from investment, right? And so where's the biggest opportunity? It's obviously in software development. I have to have a mandate at this point to enable our teams to be able to use our internal Gen AI code capabilities. We had a product called Code Whisperer that's generally available, but we're rolling it into something called Amazon Q, which is kind of a generalized AI service for enterprise that's emerging. And I have to have a roadmap for our teams to be able to be more productive using Gen AI. It's just become a mandate internally.
Sorry, Phil, the mandate is that you have to use generative AI for software development. What is the mandate?
The mandate is you have to demonstrate how you're increasing developer productivity through generative AI.
Okay.
Also, this is another study, BCG. This was done on their internal consultants, showing that ones that did or did not, based on the quality and of their output. And this is to Vib's point about, it definitely helps everybody, but it helps, bring up the bar. It raises the bar higher overall, I think, which is interesting. This is the way I would characterize this is that you're probably not going to be replaced by a robot, but maybe someone who knows how to use that model very well. And I can tell you personally, I spent the weekend actually writing our annual planning doc for my boss's organization. And I don't know a lot about some of my peers, what they're doing, I don't know their businesses as well. And so I actually used our internal AI assistant that we have, which uses the Anthropic Claude 3 model, a Haiku model. And I used it to essentially help me write their parts of the document. And what was interesting is I didn't load in all of their documents, but some of them had loaded their documents in at some point, and the model had been trained on it, and it actually started referencing their product initiatives by code, like their product code, in the responses that it provided to me. And it was mind-blowing. So I was able to write a doc in a weekend that would normally take me 2 weeks. So it was pretty amazing. And it wasn't, and it was literally because I did not have the subject matter expertise to write the document on my own. Going back to Vib's point, I had to sanity check everything for accuracy, because there are things that, like, it would make assumptions about certain things, and I'll talk about that in a minute, hallucinations that it did get wrong because I didn't understand the context enough to catch it. So so that was interesting. Going back to Amazon more broadly, I don't know if you guys have been paying attention, but we announced earnings while we've been on this call. So it looks like it. I haven't looked at it closely, but it looks like we did okay, which is a good thing, and AWS beat estimate. So that'll be good for all of us. But these are the vanity stats on Amazon. But really, this company has been using machine learning since the 90s, and in terms of its forecasting demand for products, going back to books and CDs and media, and uses it in the full supply chain life cycle, all the way through to delivery optimization, as you guys can probably expect. When a driver gets in their van in the morning, they have an optimized route given to them, right? And Gen AI is being used more and more in these areas to actually do better real-time optimizations and not just pre-planned optimizations.
I just posted the AWS earnings report from the Wall Street Journal, and Phil was being very modest. It was a pretty blowout quarter, if I can say.
Got to keep the hamster wheel spinning. So
there you go.
So let's just talk about, for us, real briefly on our buyer experience on the consumer side. And I've managed the equivalent of this on the third-party software side for AWS, but machine learning recommendations, user classification, are all used in everything you see in your Amazon experience. But when it comes to generative AI on the newer side of implementations, we're using it both to help sellers. In this case, imagine sellers. We have sellers, half of the products that are sold on the Amazon are sold by third parties. They're not directly sourced and sold by Amazon itself. And so, there's billion products here that are sold by third parties, and they have to upload to our catalog. They can do it via APIs, they can do it manually, but they also need to create descriptions, right? So obvious application of generative AI is to help them with their listing content descriptions, and helping them with accuracy and optimization for what actually helps it sell better. So there's just ton of opportunity there. And then on the consumer side, this is my favorite generative AI feature, I think, that exists in Amazon, which is summarizing reviews. All right, how many of us have spent, when we're looking at a product, trying to figure out if this is the right product, and we go through the reviews and it says there are 15,000 of them, and it's like, okay, what are we going to do? Review summarization. This is something I'm actively working on for our marketplace, software marketplace, is review summarization, because we have data that shows engagement with reviews. It has a dramatic increase in the lift of conversion. And if we can make that engagement more effective, and accelerate consideration, it will definitely have a business outcome impact. So if you haven't used this feature, or seen this in your Amazon app or browser, I'd definitely check it out.
So that's all being done by generative AI, Phil, these little summaries at the top, the ease of use stuff.
Yeah. And I actually reached out to them to see if we could use it, and they said it was not. It was only designed for their consumer use cases, and we're in negotiations with them to. And Amazon's like, what you have to understand is Amazon's very focused on, like, so Vibs talked about scale and cost. We have those issues here, right? So we have to focus on scale and cost.
Did we lose
like,
him?
you can't take another use case right now. But the reality is that Amazon, consumer, and AWS are really totally different. But other than like our backing leadership culture and structure and things like that, we don't share stuff like this generally. This is a really interesting case of actually using generative AI to enable a new technology that would have been limited in its ability to come to market. And so this is a feature, and I use it when I'm at headquarters in Seattle, usually to buy chips in the store and down in the lobby. But they have a checkout, like this biometric checkout, and this actually goes into the top layer of your palm and looks at nerve endings and things like that. It's not a fingerprint reader, right? And in order to actually train the model here for accuracy, they didn't have enough high resolution images of hands that had that kind of high res detail where they could actually look through that first layer. So what they actually did is use generative AI to create synthetic data sets of pictures of hands, high res pictures of hands, that they could then train the model on. And it has better accuracy than pretty much any biometric service out there. And it's super fast, which is really cool. I mentioned multimodal. So multimodal is definitely an increasing Gen AI use case where you might be able to snap a picture, like for instance, of a dress. Not that I would do this, but you'd say, hey, I like this dress, but I want it with short sleeves, and do that kind of search augmentation. And so multimodal is becoming much bigger. I actually was testing this out recently because I was looking at a dashboard in Salesforce and I had no idea what this dashboard meant. And so I was using multimodal to actually basically create a legend for me on what the dashboard actually referred to. So a lot of applications there. Just going to move into some of the things that I'm seeing both now. These are things that I'm seeing internally with our adoption, meaning my team's adoption of Gen AI, but also I still meet with a lot of customers. I meet with a lot of partners, meaning a third-party seller software ISVs, and this is what I'm hearing from them in terms of the major considerations or challenges. And the kind of what's changing between last year and this year. It's changing by the day. I almost named this title of this presentation the April 30th, 2024 perspective on Gen AI because it changes that often. Vibs mentioned hallucinations. That's like number one thing that I see happening. Security considerations is the big thing in the enterprise. And I'll talk about Bedrock, and I'm not trying to push Amazon Bedrock here. I'm going to talk about it in the context of how it solves a number of the problems or challenges that we have to face in the enterprise when launching Gen AI solutions around data privacy, guardrails, model selection, et cetera. So when we talk about 23, you were probably asking these questions as I was, learning about prompt engineering, learning about which models do what, the difference, what is the difference, if at all, between a foundational model and an LLM, and really just an explosion of POCs. Everything that was being done in all of our, what would be called customer innovation centers or labs, every single one was pretty much Gen AI related, right? 2024, people are now saying, okay, we need to do something about this, but these projects aren't cheap. They need to have outcomes. How do they scale? What are the kind of governance that I need to have? So like reality setting in on that, right? I still feel like we skipped some steps here. Like I feel I still see very remedial thinking around what applications there are, like too much chatbot discussion, right? And not, you know, generating synthetic data sets. That's the kind of thing that's really cool to me. There's the notion, the big ones are the call center agent, like the virtual, not, and I don't mean virtual agent as in like someone you're chatbotting with. I mean like orchestrated tasks in terms, and that's the new term. Agents is the new term for that, is orchestrating tasks.
Can you say more about that? Can you?
Yeah. So let's take the example. Let's take Splunk. Splunk wants to add a new product that they've built onto my marketplace, and to do that right now, that's pretty hard. They have to add a bunch of criteria into via API or to our user interface to put all the specifications of what the product is, what the pricing tiers are, what the contract mechanisms are, any like customer regions it's available, and then they have to onboard to our metering APIs and do a whole bunch of other know your customer stuff, and it takes weeks, and it's a lot of back and forth between our support teams and our interfaces. And so we're effectively looking at building a automated workflow that goes back and forth between our support agents and their team, the Splunk team, to manage that entire workflow in an automated fashion with responses like, hey, you missed checking which contracts vehicles you're willing to use for this particular product. And would you like to use this one? This is the most popular one. And, you know, there's an entire dialogue that we can engage in onboarding that product. And we've done some simulations where that goes from weeks to about 30 minutes. And so those are those kinds of exhaustive workflows that aren't synchronous necessarily, right? And aren't active state managed as a typical software application. There are a set of orchestrated workflows. And instead of humans triggering them back and forth, it's done through these agents. Did I describe that right, Vibs? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, we call them workflows internally, but yes, yeah.
So Phil, I watched a YouTube video the other week, I think from Sequoia. There was this guy, Andrew something, AI agentic workflows. Is that what we're talking about here?
Yeah.
Vibs, yeah.
Yeah.
Agentic, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, according to him, it's the new big thing, so I trust you.
Hey Thomas, Thomas, can you post that link on the chat?
I will.
Thank you.
I think people probably know what hallucinations are right by now, right? But I use this as an example. As you know, this is an exaggerated one. The dangerous hallucinations are the ones that are more subtle. But this is like when most of the early POCs suffer from hallucinations, and there's lots of ways to solve this, right?
That brings
And prompt engineering is one of the keys to this. I actually mentioned, the work I was doing this weekend to write the document. There's a prompt library I used, right, that helps me make sure I'm, I can say, hey, rephrase this in a more transformative tone, or I can say, evaluate this in an executive context versus like a engineering context. And so there's a whole set of prompting and that goes into, and the prompt engineering is a legitimate role, I think. I don't know about what you think, Vibs, but I think that it becomes it's definitely a skill that we need to evolve.
Yeah.
Pretty much everybody here, and everybody on our teams needs to evolve and understand prompt engineering. That's the number one way you're conversing with models. There's ways we'll talk about that aid in that, but this is like, if you don't understand how to talk to a model, you're not going to get much out of it. That's useful.
Hey, Phil, do you have a guide to prompt engineering? I noticed yesterday that OpenAI actually, or 2 days ago, they have now published a guide on sort of how to prompt engineer. And otherwise, there's also these courses that companies like Section are offering for a few $1,000s and stuff, or subscription, actually, I should say. But do you have anything like that that you can share?
Let me look. The ones I use are internal. So, but I'll look. I'm sure we have some external prompt engineering guides.
But I think the group will appreciate that for them and themselves and their teams.
Yeah. I'd be surprised also, like Anthropic's one of the big providers we used, if they didn't have a prompt engineering library. I'll look for that. This is the other thing, is that as Vibs talked about, the models, they're learning, and they're learning very quickly. But sometimes you want to have them respond the right way the first time. And so there's something, so most of the time when you're engaging with a model in a dialogue, you're doing it what's called multi-shot, right? And as it's learning, and as you ask it or to refine things, it maybe does that more natively. Again, you don't have to keep asking it to format it in the same structure or something. Or I kept telling it to not use numbered lists when I was talking to it, and eventually stopped giving me numbered lists. But sometimes you need what's called a single shot or one shot example. And so you need to like set up the prompt with some context for the model to understand how it should be responding, right? Otherwise, it's going to give you the wrong answer. This comes back to the hallucination part, where it's trying to figure out what you mean. But if you give it some better prompting here, and this is, again, the same one-shot example, the same question, but with this better input, you're able to get the accurate response. So again, the importance of prompt engineering in this, and how this becomes embedded in your applications, right? This is in the context of engaging in a chat context, but what becomes more important is when you're doing this through an application workflow, right? Where you're not seeing the actual, this is all code generated. You're not seeing the actual input.
Hey, can I just maybe this is a question for Vibs or you, I'm not exactly sure, but hey, Vibs, I've seen there's plenty of versions of these examples, but from a technology perspective, when you start giving it these training, or for lack of a better word, training prompts, what is actually happening to the parameters of the model that now it spits out the right answer, whereas without the training, it gives you the wrong answer?
So the honest answer is no one really knows what's happening. because these models are so complicated. But I think I'm guessing an answer here, which is these are all ultimately neural pathways, right? And if you think of how information is getting processed in the brain, the more input that you're giving, certain parts of the brain are lighting up, right? And similarly here in the LLMs, the parts of the model are lighting up. So, and I think that goes back to, I think, the example that Phil is giving on the math operation, or what we, when we use augmentation, I think the right slide to talk about it. When we give it specific pieces of information in the prompt that we're retrieving from a database of that information, then it narrows down quite considerably. And it's, that's one way of reducing hallucinations in the platform.
And it's giving sort of more weight to the conversation it's having with that individual at that point in time than, I guess, the way the model was trained prior to that conversation.
The weights remain same, but which, because there are all these input layers in the neural network, right?
Right.
Which pathways are lighting up
Yes.
are different.
Sorry, didn't mean to
Yeah.
interrupt.
No worries. So yeah, one of the ways to address this and to actually make the prompts more robust in your applications is through RAG, right? Retrieval Augmented Generation, where if you're engaged, if your call center app, generative AI app, is engaging with a customer on a billing question, and they didn't have they need to have the context of the customer. So in this case, what they're likely to do before the model is queried with a question from the customer, it's likely to be augmented with the customer's profile, the customer's billing history, other information that's relevant to the application context. That's submitted to the model so that the model can then generate a response that includes that augmented information in responding to the customer. And so, so this is like the main driver right now around Gen AI applications in terms of making it easier to connect customer databases, or depending on the context, like for semantic search, it might be a vector database, things like that. But it's these data sources, connectors, knowledge bases. There's different terms of art depending on which platform you're on that are used to support the prompts. And the RAG use cases, are again improving quality, context-based chatbots, personalized search. I'm working right now on trying to move marketplace from lexical keyword-based search to Gen AI enabled semantic search, right? Our catalog is going to grow by 5x over the next few years because we're adding not just software, but we're adding a bunch of partner solutions, like consulting partner solutions. And so we need better discoverability. And so we're going to be using Gen AI semantic search to help that, and also real-time summarized reviews and product guides and things like comparisons and things like that.
Hey, Phil?
Question from
Yeah.
Scott.
Yeah, on the augmentation, so it improves the prompts and the prompt engineering. Is that augmentation automatic, or are you working to automate that? In other words, the prompt may suggest to the LLM or the processing that there are other related databases that aren't necessarily part of the model, but can be queried. Is there any automation with respect to self-augmentation, if you will? Does that make sense?
I don't know. It does make sense. I haven't seen that particular use case. I don't know, Vibs, if you have any context for that.
I'm thinking, yeah, Vibs, just so someone calls into our contact center, they identify themselves as a patient, and they're trying to make an appointment, and they said, I've been here before, and maybe this is being ingested, but in any case, whether the call center rep does it or not, retrieval of their record or prior visits ought to be automated in some way. That's how we make this person super productive.
Yeah. So the LLM itself is not doing things like that, but for example, what we do is we have this symbolic AI layer that goes and pulls from APIs, for example. So let's say there is a database that has all the past records of who has visited and when they have visited. There's a customer data platform. I think Phil was talking about workflows. So in that workflow, what we'll do is we'll pull the customer information, figure out what that information is, and then pass that information if needed to the LLM to create a response for the customer. So it's not really part of the LLM, but there are other tooling around the LLM that helps you do some of those things.
So yeah, just to take a little bit further, I don't mean to delay it, but with respect to the question asked, it's almost as if there's an LLM query about how to answer this question, and the answer to that is this kind of information from the LLM is in the following databases, and then then the human now steps in. You know what I'm saying?
So Vibs, so I read something else a while ago. I think it was a paper, it wasn't as academic as I was thinking, but it was Hugging GPT, and they had an LLM to select which LLM to use to do a number of like activities, right? Like workflows.
Right.
Is that so if you train the model to which database to go and find things, you can use that first step in order to decide what to do next, right?
Thanks, Thomas.
Exactly. So this is great, Thomas. I think so. This is what we call, the technical term now that's being used. Again, the term keeps changing, but agent routing. So you have a high-level model that is deciding which sub-model to use. So there can be something that can call an API, or there's something that can go and look at documents and retrieve all that information. So the first model is deciding which of these different sub-models to use to do specific tasks. So, or it can have a chain of thought. It can say, first I need to retrieve the customer's information, and then I need to do something, and then I need to do something. And so you can also specify that in the prompt to the governing model, and then that governing model is trying to figure out how to execute each of these steps.
Because then you could train it on your different databases, right? In my case, when we have invoices or products or whatever, right? And then then that first step can select where to go next.
Exactly.
Which is kind of what Scott is looking for.
Right.
So, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to put on the table for subsequent discussion, maybe offline with Vibs or you, Phil, but the idea of a curated large language model to where rather than just ingest the world, ingest things that are less likely to have alternative facts, to use that phrase, for example. To me, I'm very interested in that subject with respect to healthcare. So just want to throw it out.
Sure. Yeah, would love. I had a slide that I skipped, but it talked about exactly what you're talking about, Scott.
Okay.
Happy to talk about that later or offline.
But and that's go ahead, Vijay.
Viv, I'd like your point about so basically there's a whole governance model, because this is one thing that even I've been thinking about a lot, which is you've got these large scale LLMs, but then you've got a very specific process within your organization, right? And I think if I heard you correctly, it could be deterministic, where when a patient comes in for a specific thing, okay, you don't need it to use another layer of AI. You basically simply say, go retrieve all of these things based on who the patient is.
Yeah.
And then add that as input to the LLM. In another context, it could be actually the governance model actually involves more AI, because it says, I don't really know what to do here, so give me some probabilities for where I should pull from. Are both of those feasible?
Yes, they are. I think they work to a certain extent. Again, there's no silver bullet here, I think, as Phil can also attest to.
Because I keep reading these process descriptions of how companies are using generative AI, and because so many of these use cases are very individualized, but clearly there has to be a master process somewhere, right? That's pretty obvious.
Yeah, and there are different ways to build this. I don't want to take away from what Phil has to say, but
we can go offline.
I can talk about that later.
Yeah, no, it's all, so super interesting discussion, and going back to Scott's original question, what I've seen when RAG use cases is that, and to Vib's point around when you're orchestrating, these aren't like typical applications, right? These are orchestrated workflows, and what you'll sometimes see is that they'll actually use an LLM in the process of creating the prompt. to validate or improve the prompt before it actually sends the full RAG augmented prompt to the destination the end LLM. So you have that multi-model use within that workflow, right? And Scott, and
what does RAG stand for? Remind me again. Sorry. RAG.
Sorry,
it's been back in slides. I think.
Oh, I really missed it.
It's retrieval augmented generation. So, and Vijay's point, where you said there's a whole other, like, how do we operate as a company? This is the big thing that's happening in enterprises right now is what do we need? What's required for us? I mean, I can't imagine being a CISO right now in an enterprise trying to take on this burden in addition to everything else that they're trying to deal with. And essentially building, I mean, it's not just a bolt-on, really. They have to rethink this from holistically, from a policy, governance, and compliance standpoint, because it changes so much. There's an example going around internally about a healthcare customer who was doing a POC. I think it was a POC. I hope it was a POC. And they had ingested, from their corpus of data they had trained, and unfortunately on a model that said, in response to what can I do to treat anxiety, and this model suggested smoking as a as a solution because that was somewhere in their health database from decades ago. So there's lots of considerations there. Wouldn't be good.
When you go back to first principles, this help me understand from a generative AI perspective, what's the mechanism by which it increases the risk level of from cybersecurity, the cybersecurity risk level? Like, why is it different from other databases, or like what's different here?
Well, maybe Vibs has a better academic answer than this.
I'm not looking for an academic, looking for a practice answer.
Or he's had to deal with investors on this one. But the big thing is your data going into some other model you have no control over, and it's there in perpetuity. Like that's just an absolute nightmare.
If it leaves your organization, goes to some public
data leakage.
Yeah, and I can answer practically because this is what we're wrestling with. And to your point, Phil, I can quote what our CISO Forrest wrote to me just on Friday. Actually, he says, "I feel more like an acrobat than a CISO these days, LOL." And he was just in the process of releasing our AI policy, like an updated version of our AI policy. But what we are worried about is related to what I said before. That we're somewhat worried about people ingesting our data. I think Phil, you had an example of the Samsung code, for example. So we're worried about our people doing that, getting our data out there in the public LLM domain. But we're also worried about internally, like I gave my own example with my own healthcare appointment there, and we've seen other examples because there is so much data, terabytes of data around our databases, around our SharePoint sites, around our OneDrives, around our other shared folders, shared email. Just if you look at some of the Microsoft technologies, the co-pilots have access to so much that probably could be dug out by someone even today without AI. But it would never happen because they would never dig as deep as to find that specific record, and they don't even know that this is shared in let's say in a public folder, or you're part of a group in Active Directory, which actually has access to something in finance or whatever. But Copilot doesn't care. Copilot finds it because it will go through all of this and find this, and it does display a number of things which we are worried about, Vijay, from a compliance perspective and governance perspective, things that we really don't want even our own associates necessarily to see. And then the next step, if we accidentally ingest this into a public LLM somewhere, and it's used for training and becomes in that model forever. So we are super concerned about that, both legal and CISOs and other audit and compliance people.
Right.
Yeah.
I'll just add one more thing to that, which is something that has come up in some of our conversations is when you're using, especially when you're using this for code generation or content writing, there is a big copyright nightmare, which is actually from a code perspective, it's a big nightmare. Like I asked, let's say, GitHub Copilot to generate code for me, and then I put that code in, and God forbid that code was part of GPL. Now, technically, your entire code base is part of GPL, right? So there are all of these issues around copyright and IP, and no one really knows how to think about them or solve them. So I think the approach, a lot of companies are saying, okay, you're not going to use any of these tools, even though they might be effective, because we have this IP nightmare right in front of us.
I also worry about what happens if, the New York Times wins its case. And like, are these LLMs, how are they going to get rid of the data they've been trained on? And then that affects the performance of everybody else who's now already using these models, right? So it'll be interesting. But anyway, Phil, let's give you some time to get to the end of your talk.
Yeah. So just to continue on that theme, while the prior slide was kind of the new CISO world, this is like, I think we need HR for AI, which is interesting because there's a whole other set of issues that are being tackled, right? That are not necessarily InfoSec related, but more around your brand and your corporate culture, and the integrity or fidelity of your product offering. So there's a whole host of issues that are still being wrestled with here. And that's why, going back to my original cynicism, when you put a chat prompt in front of someone, and now like my 80-year-old mom's asking me about AI, it's like, that's, we've gotten ahead of ourselves a little bit, I think, but we can also see the potential. But corporate fiduciary responsibilities sometimes lead us otherwise. When it comes to some of these challenges, I'll give you an example of how AWS specifically is thinking about solving these for the enterprise, right? And so this is not a sales pitch. This is just giving you an example of how some of these are being solved. And so Bedrock is our product that gives you an API interface to foundational models, right? And it does that through a single interface with multiple models. It allows you to customize them, include RAG capabilities, and also the agents that I was talking about, which is our nomenclature for workflows, for multi-step tasks, as well as handles privacy and security. If you think about it in our stack for generative AI in particular, it kind of sits in the middle, meaning at the bottom we have our purpose-built chipsets that are infrastructure that's really designed, and some of our like our SageMaker Studio for ML development, that are really for the low-level machine learning AI, generative AI capabilities. Bedrock's in that middle tier, and then the top tier are more of the interface solutions like Q. I mentioned Q, Q Developer. These are like knowledge-based chat interface AI assistants.
What does the letter Q refer to here? Like, what is it? Like, all of those are Q, so there's some class of applications, or what is that?
Amazon Q is a new product line, right? So I think it's referring to like the James Bond person, like the
Q, I remember.
in their voice, right? So I'm not positive on that. I wasn't involved in the naming.
All the whiz bang technology, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Bedrock has foundational models, so obviously there's other offerings from Microsoft and Google around foundational models or large language models. Here we also have our own. We have our own Titan models, which have text embeddings and as well as image generation. But then Anthropic is where we're seeing like probably the most activity right now. But Meta has their Llama 3 models, Llama 2 and Llama 3. And then you guys are probably familiar with Stability. You've used Stable Diffusion for image generation in the past.
Actually, still on that slide, because there's been so much talk in the press about all these different models and who will survive and blah 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 blah. What's your take on sort of how these foundation model market actually develops and matures? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, going back to Scott's question, we definitely are seeing purpose-built industry use case models emerge. Here, these are more generalized models. So if you look at the Anthropic Claude 3 models, they've now come out with tiered models that are centered around latency, cost, and they're the size of the parameters that are a part of the model, right? So, so the smaller number of parameters, the cheaper they run, faster they run, that kind of thing. So more purpose-built models for scale, as Vibs was talking about scale being an issue, as well as trained on industry use cases.
And so you are beginning to see specialized in industry-specific models now?
Yeah, well, where we're seeing it is people taking these models and training them on different data sets.
Okay. Got it.
So that's so going back to some of the security things on guardrails, this is like one way that we try and help with providing guardrails in the middle tier of building these capabilities. Is it could be everything from don't use foul language to don't provide PII or something like that, right? And then the key thing with these models, so this is the big issue, going back to what we were talking about in the whole discussion here, is your data leakage, right? So these allow you to use these models without the models training, using your data to train the underlying models. So these are effectively copies, and the data is not used for training. And that's the big, if you want to call it, value prop for these kinds of cloud-based offerings of the models. And it provides, the native encryption and transit and rest and all that kind of stuff.
And that works.
And then
foundation model.
I'm sorry.
And that works no matter which foundation model you choose to use, whether Anthropic or Llama or whatever.
For the ones in Bedrock, yes.
Yeah.
And then lastly, how do you choose a model, right? Which one should you choose? And so there's lots of criteria that you can use to choose. And so it allows you to kind of test against your use cases for toxicity, refusal rate, things like that, and see which model, on a Likert scale, kind of has the best response to your use case or your data, whatever. And so that's kind of an example of that's one implementation. There's other providers doing implementations that are similar to Bedrock, that you can look at as well. So maybe I'll stop there, Vijay, and
you want to show a couple of use cases? We have a little bit of time.
Sure. So, just as I mentioned before, some of the instead of the generalized chatbots, they're seeing industry focused use cases, right? financial services. I think that's what you're focused on, Vibs, right? For your for Altius.
Oh, I was on mute. Yeah, that's what we are focused on. But a lot of the customer focused use cases also.
It feel free.
But they're definitely on these industry focused cases. Yeah, good. Am I not there?
No, you're there. You're back.
You guys see me? Okay. So here's an example. Verafin, if you guys don't know, is a NASDAQ company, right? And they basically try to identify financial crime and through financial transactions. And so they actually have a very highly manual human labor capital driven business through their investigations work, and so rather than the actual investigation, most of it is like what we would call like the pre-trial work. And so when they went and implemented a Gen AI solution to try and essentially recapture some of that manual area of their work, first thing they started seeing was hallucinations. And here, going back to Scott's question, they actually focused on prompt engineering, and they validated their prompts with like test data sets and intermediate model validation. So they were able to like dramatically reduce their time spent on investigations. This is an interesting one because it's technically a production implementation use case, but it's also kind of offline because the next step goes to an actual effort. It's not like they're giving the customer a response. They actually still have to go and validate this. And but the discovery that they had to do, the summarization, the applicable case law, that kind of thing has all been dramatically reduced through something like their generative AI use case. Another one is Iveco, if you guys know, a truck company. So theirs was really kind of improving their driver buddy application with increased capabilities. They had some core principles that they have for their business around improving driver safety and energy consumption and other business KPIs. And so they essentially built these generative AI based interfaces into their new driver PAL version of their application. And we're able to provide, in real time versus, like a lot of like how a lot of the delivery companies work is they get a plan at the beginning of the route, and that's their plan. But as things happen, things change. And so they were able to address more of the dynamic issues and reduce unplanned stops and overall ETA and energy consumption. And that's through this kind of like back and forth interface that they added to their driver PAL application. So I just added a couple, Vijay.
Okay, that's great.
Yep.
Any closing thoughts? And then we have about 8 minutes left, so let's
I would just say, there's lots of resources if you want on AWS. There's plenty of others as well outside of AWS. If you want to look at other use cases, you can find those here. You can also look at the solutions that we already have or already developed. A lot of these are through like third parties, partners. Some of them are AWS developed that have been developed for customers already that have specific use cases that you might want to look at. And that's it.
well, That was great, both of you. Thank you so much. But we have like 7 minutes now, so I'm just going to turn it over to whoever has a comment or question or wants to talk about things they're doing. Floor is open.
Just to add a bit to what I said about our investment and use of Bridge. Phil, I don't know if you're involved, and I don't have all of the details, but we're working with AWS, one of our radiologists, on X-ray, we take X-rays all the time, we take CT scans, but X-rays looking for lung nodules. And nodules can be sort of, where cancer starts. And a lot of people are screened if they were ever exposed to smoking or they happen to smoke themselves, for example. And maybe as much as 10% of the time or more, a nodule might be missed by a physician. So it's almost like a second pair of eyes. It's not really a second read, but we're actually doing that now in our precision health strategy plan for the year, is to continue to do those kinds of things to basically augment the work of the physician, because it's really pretty good at being able to pick things out. There's been a lot of that work in breast mammography for the last 15 years, 20 years, because of, if you go back into the 80s and 90s, women were dying left and right in their 30s and 40s. Paul McCartney's wife, Elizabeth Montgomery from Bewitched, all these women from breast cancer, a lot of that's been really mitigated to a great degree with advanced technology. So mammography and stuff is really advanced, but still, and those are all double read by humans. So what can we do to do the same kind of thing with all the other kind of images that are taking place? So Dan Chow is working with your organization here to do that. It's really pretty cool.
That's a great one.
So actually, Dan Chow was my student, and he's joined, even though he's not Mirage faculty. Yesterday we kicked off our Mirage faculty working group for AI, because some of us in this information technology group are sort of basically saying we need to jumpstart the conversations among faculty who are not as aware. And we got 40 out of the 50 faculty signing up, and like 27 showed up yesterday. So it was it's fun to see. But Dan Chow is a part of that group. I don't know why he wants to join the Mirage group, but he teaches for us, I think. So, but it's
yeah. I'm sorry I missed it. And there's Peter Chang. There's some others, but
yeah.
I think we want to do more anyway.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Hey Jim, I just see you popped up. You turned your camera on. So, any thoughts about generative AI? Jim's got, for those of you who don't know, he's schools first and has a lot of customer interaction. So I'm sure some of the stuff Vibs is doing is, I don't know if you were there for that part of it, but it's very interesting.
I snuck in. I was running late from other meetings, but I appreciate the presentation today, Philip and Vibs. I thought that was really, really great. I was trying to just stay quiet. We are doing some things with the generative AI natural language processor, but today we're using that internally. So we have an internal library that we are populating with our standard operating procedures and all of our policies, all of our scripting, so that if you come into a branch, if you call us, if you go online, you get the same messages, the same content, the same recommendations and consultative feedback that you get across any channel. So we're trying to standardize service and make sure we're getting better consistency with our frontline teams using AI. And so that's really where we're leveraging it today, in the anticipation that once it gets tuned enough, then we can put those things out onto our website for members to use too. We're not there yet. We're not comfortable with that yet.
That's great, Jim. I think that's one thing that we have noticed is both on the sales agent side and the support agent side, you can drive a lot more homogeneity and the experience when you use these types of, it can be internal facing and they're prompting what needs to be said to the user, but that drives sort of a much better experience, a more uniform experience at the very least.
And it's been hugely, to Philip's earlier point, every day it gets so much better. The more we put into this, the faster it learns, the better it gets. It's been transformative in reducing call volume in some of our channels. So and improving agents' efficiency. So it's been really impactful, and we know it's continuing. So it's for financial services, AI is transforming everything we do.
Yeah.
One of the comments I heard just a couple of days ago, which I'm sure most of you have heard some version of, this was in the context of ChatGPT, but said, don't think about ChatGPT 4, think about ChatGPT 6, which is, not that far around the corner. So oftentimes we hold ourselves back thinking the technology is not ready. But in 6
Right.
months, we're going to have a completely different foundation model, right? Whether it's Anthropic or something else. And I think it's
Right.
very hard to plan. And that one board director told me that half the companies she's on, the boards that don't have an AI strategy, but the ones that do, they get stuck because every 3 months their strategy is outdated, and so they're still struggling with how do you keep adapting when the world is moving so fast. Which leads me to a question for all of you, because I thought this was one of the most stimulating discussions we've had. So again, thank you, Vibs and Phil. It was just sort of, you guys really sort of built off each other beautifully, and I think we learned a lot. Is there more interest in sort of digging even deeper into this? Because, for example, I'm the woman who's the head of AI for Verizon is a good friend of the center and a friend of mine. And so if this is of interest, I'd be happy to invite some, and there's others too. So invite someone like that to talk to this group where you can really go deeper into. This was just sort of our intro to generative AI. And of course, all of you are savvy consumers as it is. So Paul, is that a yes? You would like some more deep dives into AI? And I see Jim shaking.
Absolutely. Particularly anyone who'd be willing to talk about governance for
Yeah.
something they've implemented in production would be really interesting.
Yeah, in fact, I think Phil's slide on governance really jumped out at me because, I mean, behind that, I'm sure there's a policy somewhere, right? I mean, so there's got to be a lot of, and that's the number one question I keep hearing about is people are really worried about the sort of the legal and moral risks of what is happening with generative AI.
Yeah, I'm sure y'all saw articles where an AI bot for a bank gave someone the incorrect information on rates, and they had to honor that rate, and that opened the door to other lawsuits. So it's very real risk that we run if we don't.
That was wasn't that Air? There's an Air Canada version of that too.
Yeah.
There was. Yeah.
So
So
fascinating.
I think VJ would be interesting I see it from two aspects. Those companies that are large enough, big enough, have the moxie, so to speak, to sort of do it on their own.
Right.
And those more ordinary citizens, I put us in that category, set aside researchers like Dan Chow, picking tools like AWS or whoever to try to solve problems. And I think Vib said one difference that he observed was it's more outcomes based, not what all you can do with it.
That was a very good insight, actually. I wrote that down. It jumped out at me. There's a big difference in the way we automate.
Yeah. So our outcome is we want a better patient experience. That's a horribly general one. But how do we go about that with generative AI? So I would be interested in both aspects of it.
But the other thing we didn't talk about, because today was not the right time for it, but a lot of these companies are actually building off of open source models, right? Because they exist. Somebody mentioned Hugging Face earlier, right? So there's a lot of these models that can be customized to. But then again, you do need the talent, and I'm not sure UCI will necessarily have that kind of talent to do that.
Right. Well, just to tag on to that, VJ, does that pose higher risk? You go open source, are you incurring, all kinds of aberrations that might otherwise be the case if you use a set of curated tools?
Well, Llama is open source, so I'm not. So it's sort of interesting, right?
Yeah. So I can talk to that a little bit, Scott. So, I personally don't think, and Phil can probably speak to this, is there's much sense in any company to train their own model. I think Bloomberg did passes this. They trained it a model, an LLM on all their data, and it was better than GPT 3.5. But I think there's a recent paper that came out that talks about. In fact, there's a paper from Bloomberg that says GPT-4 is so much better than the Bloomberg GPT. So I personally believe that there will be these large foundational models being provided by Amazon, Microsoft, bunch of other players, Google, and some of their partners. And I think where the use case or the innovation will lie in applications is companies trying to use these language models in the repertoire of other tools they're using to drive certain use cases, right? Using RAG architecture, using some other architectures to really, there are ways in which you can modify these models in a way that, if you can get your private instance of a Claude model. I think Phil will probably know this better, but I think you can get your private instance of an LLM which you can fine tune on Amazon or Microsoft or Google, in which case your data is not going outside. It's going to that LLM, but that LLM is in your secure environment. So I would say a lot of the innovation is going to happen on how do you use an open source model or open model with your own custom data, not necessarily going to an open endpoint. It can be an internal endpoint in your workspace.
So Phil, can you speak to that? Because your LLMs have probably, I mean, you probably negotiate some of the, I mean, not you personally, but your unit negotiates some of these deals, right? Where the private use cases for these large models.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Dib describes is exactly the way that it's evolving, which is you don't want to hit a public endpoint with your data or with your prompts even, and so you are effectively taking a copy and deploying a copy. Now the devil's in the details there, in terms of managing, deploying, upgrading, expanding, that kind of thing, further training. Or you might not want to train it. Like there's some data you could say like we can't train our model on this stuff, how we're using it, because it would violate whatever governance or privacy we have. And so we have to actually ensure that our data, nothing's being trained that's going through this model. And so they're effectively all all private copies of these LLMs.
I think we're beyond time, but that was so stimulating and so incredibly interesting. So thank you, Phil and Bibbs, and thank you to the rest of you for joining.